Diversity and the Office for Diversity and Inclusion. Our lecture today will be recorded. I'm Tony Stern. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Gender Equity and Clinical Affairs. I am also the System Vice Chair for Quality, Clinical Transformation, and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion within the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Science here at Mount Sinai. We are truly honored today to welcome our speaker Maria Mia Ong, PhD, who's going to speak to us about invisibility and recognition in STEM. Dr. Ong is a senior research scientist and evaluator at Technical Education Research Centers, or TERC, and her focus is mathematics and education. Prior to working at TERC, Dr. Ong served as within faculty at Swarthmore College, Wellesley College, Harvard University Graduate School of Education. Dr. Ong has researched the lived experience of women of color and other marginalized groups in STEM. She is the author of The Double Bind in Physics Education, Intersectionality, Equity, and Belonging for Women of Color, and numerous articles on the Journal of Research and Science Teaching and the Journal of Engineering Education. Dr. Ong was the co-recipient of the U.S. Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring, and has also served on national advisory committees, including NSF Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science and Engineering, and the National Academies Committee on Policies and Practices for Supporting Caregivers Working in Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics, and Medicine. In today's session, Dr. Ong draws from 25 years of qualitative research to describe instances of invisibility and lack of recognition in STEM spaces for women of color, students, and young professionals. Invisibility and recognition are explored against the ideals of meritocracy, a concept often held sacrosanct in STEM academia. We look forward to her also sharing recommendations for advancing women of color and members of other minoritized groups in STEM. Thank you, Dr. Ong.
Thank you, Dr. Stern, for the very kind introduction. I'm going to share my slides now. Does that work? Thumbs up.
Perfect.
Thank you. All right, please shout out if things go wrong, as they have in the past. Good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you to Dr. Stern for the very gracious introduction. And thank you to Dr. Sandra Mazur and other organizers of the Amplify Equity series for the opportunity to be here. As some of you may know, Dr. Mazur and I served together on the National Academies Committee. It's a very long name, so I call it the Caregiving Committee at the National Academies. And some of my favorite moments have been walking and talking with her during our meetings. She's so funny and brilliant. And when she reached out to me about giving a talk here today, I couldn't refuse, and I'm very honored to be here. So again, my title, the title of my talk is Invisibility and Recognition in STEM, with the second M, of course, signifying medicine. And I'll divulge up front, as I have, as we are starting to gather here. I'm not an expert in medicine. I've studied for a couple of decades or more the fields of physics, computer science, and engineering, and general STEM without the M, the second M. But I believe I was invited here today because my work does focus on gender equity, and specifically for women of color. So the intersectionality aspect is very important. Again, in my talk today, I'll be introducing some of the key elements of my book that was just mentioned by Dr. Stern. And as with all of the work that I do, I'm hoping that to share some thoughts towards creating systemic change and to retain and advance women and women of color and members of other minoritized groups in STEM fields. Did it advance?
It did.
Thank you. Okay. I think we're good. So I want to briefly introduce myself. I am a social scientist, again at TERC. TERC is a STEM education research and development organization based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I used to stand for Technical Education Research Centers, but about 5 years ago, we changed to just the acronym. I focus on qualitative research, and since the 90s, I've been studying the lived experiences of students and professionals of color, and mostly women of color, in various STEM fields. I've had about 14 NSF-funded projects, including 3 current ones, and as well as funding from NIH and US Department of Education, but mostly my work is funded by NSF. And my research goals, if I could say it in a sentence, have been to eliminate aspects of science culture that are supports or barriers to non-traditional students and professionals. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I currently live in a town known as Carlisle, Massachusetts, and I want to acknowledge that this is located on never ceded territory of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts Nation lands. I reside here with my husband, who is a physicist, and our 11-year-old child, and as well as our 2 cats and 6 chickens. So the agenda is I'm going to just go over do an overview of the history and the background of how I got into this work, and then describe the research methods. And next, I'm going to introduce intersectionality theory and how it informs my analysis. And then I'll just zoom in to discuss the concepts of meritocracy and recognition and invisibility. And I'll link it later on to the Matthew and Matilda effects, and then discuss findings in research in physics as well as medicine. And then we'll conclude with recommendations, and there should be plenty of time for questions. So I want to share how I got into this work. I have always been surrounded by science and math. I've always loved these subjects, and I was a strong student in math and science. I'm the daughter of a now retired chemical engineer, my father, and an accountant, my mother. My older brother attended MIT. I think he majored in mechanical engineering, and he went on to become a neurosurgeon. So growing up, STEM was part of our daily conversations, part of my daily lives. I helped my mother with her accounting when she brought it home. In high school, again, as I said, I was a very strong math and science student. I competed in Odyssey of the Mind, which is a regional and national problem-solving competition. And I did that for 3 years, sophomore year through graduation. And I also attended for 2 years Science Saturdays, which is an honors science institute, where we were exposed to cutting edge research. And the ways I got into that was I had a really excellent chemistry teacher, Mr. Vogler, and that's the picture on your right. And he encouraged curiosity and problem solving. And he was also our Odyssey of the Mind coach. And he was, in fact, the regional director for close to 3 decades. We are still in touch. He sometimes just texts me about things that are happening in my old hometown, and I'm very fond of him. Because of the influence of Mr. Vogler, as well as my father, I was a chemistry major through my junior year of college. And I found that I enjoyed studying people more. However, I never really left the sciences. When I got to graduate school, I took on a role of coordinating an undergraduate physics program, and I appreciated the social aspects of student support. I I managed about 300 students in physics and in engineering who were taking physics courses. And I loved that job. I just loved working with the students. But I also noticed some unique experiences for people in physics who embodied intersectionality, especially those who were both women and a member of a minoritized racial or ethnic group. So after leaving the position, I created a research project that asked the question, in what ways do women of color experience physics environments? And then later on, as I realized I was going to be following them for a longitudinal study, I added the questions, what informs their decisions throughout higher education and careers? And whoops, here are some images of me in the field over the past couple of decades. Just discussing my research methods very briefly. In my physics research, I report on a study that included 10 women of color. And these women identified as African American or Black, Latina or Chicana, Indigenous or Native, Filipina American, Asian American, and mixed or multiple race or ethnicity. And I followed them throughout their undergraduate careers and into their next steps, graduate school or work, and onto their careers as going forward. And it's been 25 years and it's still going on. All 10 of the students that I've started following received undergraduate degrees in physics or a physics-related field, such as engineering physics. And 7 of them went on to receive PhDs in physics. I collected ethnographic data in their classrooms and their laboratories, their dorms and homes, as well as their workplaces. And I conducted regularly interviews with them. And when I had the opportunity, I also interviewed their family members, peers, and advisors. For analysis of the data, I applied hybrid coding and then followed by thematic analysis. And I also applied in the frame of intersectionality theory. So intersectionality theory, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this concept. It's a concept that frames and informs my work, as I've noted. Due to limitations, I'm not going to go into detail about it today, but this theory was developed by a legal scholar in the late 80s and into the 90s, and critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. She used intersectionality theory to describe the ways in which racism intersects with other oppressions in the lived experiences of people of color. And many other scholars have taken up this topic of intersectionality. It's actually very popular now in STEM education, especially regarding race and gender, but also race and disability and race and LGBTQ status. But I just wanted to share that the authors of the influential books here on this slide were very, very foundational for my work. So another term for intersectionality is double bind. In 1976, scientists Shirley Malcolm, Paula Hall, and Janet Brown published a seminal report through the American Association for the Advancement of Science called The Double Bind, The Problem of Being a Minority Woman in Science. So this report was the first written piece to raise the issues of the status and experiences of women of color in STEM. And this was a report that came out of a gathering, a small conference from the year before. The double bind term, which many of you will recognize as a scientific term, here refer to the unique challenges minority women faced as they simultaneously experienced sexism and racism in their STEM careers. They pointed out that programs aimed to help women in science mainly benefited white women, and programs aimed to help racial or ethnic minorities tended to benefit men. And meanwhile, minority women remained invisible and underserved. So my work builds directly off of the contributions of Malcolm and her colleagues. So now I'm going to cover the concepts of meritocracy, recognition, and invisibility. To lead us into this work, I wanted to share a quote from Irene, a pseudonym for a participant in my physics study. Irene says about her undergraduate years as a physics major, "I tended to not think about race and culture and gender as much as other people think about it. I guess it wasn't so much that I didn't think about it, but I rejected the notion that this had a big effect on people. Back then, before knowing about the larger structures at work, I believed completely in the meritocracy of science." So I'll ask you to take a moment to consider the two phrases that I've bolded by Irene. So what does the meritocracy of science mean? And what are these larger structures at work? And we will return to Irene in a few moments. So researchers Mary Blair Loy, who is one of our fellow members on the NASEM Caregiving Committee, and her colleague, Erin Seck, published a book in 2022 called Misconceiving Merit. And this book explores how the concept of merit operates in the STEM workplace. So in their book, the authors highlight schemas of work devotion and scientific excellence that are considered to be unquestionable pillars of success in science. Their research shows that even women and people of color, among other marginalized groups in science, believe in the twin schemas of work devotion and scientific excellence. So the characteristics of work-based merit, work devotion, are considering STEM as a calling, gaining inspiration from STEM, willingness to spend inordinate amounts of time working, and having a moral and emotional identification with STEM and the institution that allows them to do this work. It also calls for just the willingness to drop everything and travel in the name of science and advancement of science. The characteristics of scientific excellence include the belief in individualistic creative brilliance and assertive characteristics such as competitiveness, self-promotion, and risk-taking. Blair, Loy, and Seck emphasize that these are not objective or neutral sets of skills. They are cultural models that help to compose a professional meaning system and to maintain an unequal status quo. Let me emphasize unequal status quo. So one of my mentees, just to give you an example, she returned from her first professional computer science conference a few months ago. She's a graduate student, a woman of color. And when I asked her about it, she said that she had a good time. She had learned a lot, but she found it strange that the people that, following a talk, the people who talked first and loudest during the Q&A process session seemed to be really highly regarded. And she also said, well, it had nothing to do with the content of their comments, but more about their rushing up the hall, the aisle to talk and to raise a question, or standing up first and taking up space. And considering these schemas, being first and loudest relates to assertive characteristics. I thought it was for somebody who is new to that space, I thought it was a very insightful observation. So how we understand and talk about meritocracy are important because they relate to how we think about recognition and the outcomes of recognition, and ultimately belonging and leadership in STEM fields. So I'm going to move on to recognition and invisibility. So I want to now visit the concept of recognition, which in 2007 was put forth by Heidi Carloni and Angela Johnson in their study on STEM identities of women of color undergraduates. So here's a slide outlining 3 key elements of their original model. There's STEM social performance, meaning you enact the role and activities of scientists. STEM competence as judged by grades and understanding, and recognition as a scientific person by the self and by meaningful others. And meaningful means signals, professors, and peers in STEM. So at the beginning of their study, Carloni and Johnson believed that together, these 3 concepts would equally help form the scientist identities of women of color undergraduates in the study. They expected that students' race and ethnic and gender identities would mediate these experiences. And then they did the study, and upon concluding it, they came out with a different model. And they expressed their surprise in their paper, which I highly recommend. They were surprised to learn that while performance and competence were important and necessary, they were not good predictors of strong scientist identities. However, recognition was by far the best predictor of scientist identity development. So on the one hand, positive recognition by meaningful others, including encouragement and awards from professors and peers of the same field, helped the women of color to project themselves as future scientists. And this is the path that's marked on the green to the left on your screen. See if I can move this. On the other hand, negative recognition, and this can come in the form, many different forms, including disparaging remarks and other microaggressions, exclusion from study groups, especially negative recognition by meaningful others, typically resulted in what they called a disrupted scientist identity, and that's marked by the red path in the middle. Carloni and Johnson also found that some students who loved science and received some recognition from what they call non-scientific others, like family members or friends outside of the field, they took middle paths marked in yellow, where they had aspirations for altruistic STEM jobs, such as saying, I want to go into STEM elementary education or communication in museums for science. So those are the 3 paths that they found. And I will move on now to invisibility, visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility. And invisibility and hypervisibility in science contexts operate as the opposite of recognition. So researcher Isis Settles and her colleagues studied how visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility played roles in the advancement and day-to-day experiences of faculty of color, not necessarily STEM, but faculty of color. They found that visibility and invisibility, something as simple as eye contact or being noticed when you walk into the room, were very deeply connected to power and privilege. So Settles and colleagues claimed that members of the dominant group impose invisibility or hypervisibility, which is defined as extreme visibility, on marginalized members as a way of remaining in power. And just to give you one small example, here's a quote by, in the research by Johnson. It's a quote by a Black graduate student in engineering whose peers and professors, who were predominantly white, were exercising a type of invisibility on her. And she says, we have 5 classes together, yet I see you in the hallway and you look through me. And there's more to this quote. but I hope you get the sense of imposing invisibility. Another form of invisibility is structural. Kevin Gonzalez has written about structural invisibility imposed on Chicano students at a predominantly white university through the campus's emphasis on European art. So he studied Chicano undergraduates. And Gonzalez claimed that the lack of Chicano artwork on campus signaled to Chicano students that they did not fully belong. Within physics and other science fields, structural invisibility might be signaled by the lack of gender-neutral bathrooms or hallways filled with photographs of eminent scientists who are overwhelmingly white men. One person in my physics study said, when I need to use the restroom, when a guy in my lab needs to use the restroom, he goes 3 doors down. When I need to use the restroom, I have to go take a flight down and go to the other side of the hall, down the whole hallway. So that's one. Another example of structural invisibility from one of my current research projects is from a Native American postdoctoral fellow in the biological sciences. And she talked about in her institution's website, and she said, the banner image on the landing page that's supposed to be here for all postdocs, but it's only 5 white dudes talking to each other. And she sent a photograph along with it as evidence. But again, that is another, I think, stark example of institutional invisibility for certain groups. So, even in this case, especially without any words at all, messages about who belongs can be really loud and clear. So visibility is related, again, to recognition. So for example, if you're a graduate student or an early career scientist, like the people I've been studying, under the right circumstances, you might be seen working hard late at night, many nights in a row, or you might be noticed giving a talk at a prestigious conference. So the recognition and reward might be a professor holding you in higher esteem, and willing to let you have more leadership on a project. But unfortunately, members of underrepresented groups do not usually receive the visibility and recognition at the same levels as members of majority groups. And by majority, of course, I mean white men. Blair Loy and Seck have put it this way. Previous studies have shown that underrepresented groups generally have to be even more productive than their white men peers to amass the same visibility. So research, including my own, shows that people who are marginalized can also manipulate visibility and invisibility as a navigation strategy. And they do this to avoid harassment. Some of the participants in my study talk about the ways that they carefully choose their clothing before they head into school or into work. They make sure that they play down any clothing that reveals the shape of their bodies. They choose drab colors and keep the pink and other bright colors in their closet. And they also manipulate invisibility to avoid revealing any weakness, such as asking for a clarification on an issue. Asking questions is seen as signaling, in their minds, signaling weakness. And yet, Settles and colleagues warn that the management of invisibility, first of all, takes up a lot of time and energy, and it can also backfire. Some examples of that, given what I just said, was you could walk away not having a full understanding of an issue if you don't ask the questions you need to ask. And I think something that's very important in the study that I do on women of color is that when you are making these decisions of certain types of invisibility, you don't have the ability, you rob yourself of the ability to bring your whole self to the workplace. And then I am going to move on to some examples. I'm
fragmented information.
I'm going to share some examples of invisibility and lack of recognition from my book through the experiences of one participant, Irene, who I've introduced already. Irene identifies as a Filipina and sometimes identifies as an Asian American woman. And I ask you to consider the points of recognition and invisibility and cultural practices that systematically challenge the belonging of Irene and others like her. So example one, I'll just talk as you read and I'll provide some more background. So example one took place when Irene was an upper division undergraduate physics student. She was a physics major. She and her partner, Kyle, a white man, they were doing a lab, and Irene asked a question that neither of them could answer. They approached the professor, and this is a new professor. They thought he was really young and cool. And Irene posed their question. And the professor started to answer while looking at Irene, and then broke eye contact and switched to Kyle, to looking directly at Kyle and delivering the rest of his answer to Kyle. Irene asked another question, and the professor did the same thing. And it happened for several cycles. And in the years since this happened, in my interviews with Irene, this incident always comes up. And it's one of the moments of just utter confusion for her. And in fact, she told me that she and Kyle even talked about it, and they were both confused about what happened. And 20 years after this incident, more than 20 years after this incident, Irene was able to recall it in vivid detail. Example two. This is again happening while Irene is I think reflecting on her undergraduate years. She described why she never went to professors' office hours. As an undergraduate, she was consumed with the fear that people would perceive her as dumb, and the reason she gave is because she said she was a woman, and she didn't want to give off that impression. So she explained, why else would you go to a professor in office hours except to admit, I don't understand this. Could you explain it to me? And then she went on to say, as a reflection, and it's probably the reason why I didn't get to know many of my professors as an undergraduate. And so as this quote illustrates, making herself invisible had an upside as far as her navigation was concerned, and it also had downsides of decreasing opportunities for recognition for Irene and getting to know her professors and forming relationships with them. And this especially came to bear when she went to ask for letters of recommendation for graduate school. She told me that her professors barely knew her. They couldn't enthusiastically vouch for her. They could report her grade in a short letter, but they didn't really know her. So a lot of her letters were pretty much standard, and she attributes her not getting into her first choice to that as largely that phenomenon that happened. In example three, as I mentioned, this is a longitudinal study, so I've been following them into graduate school. In this example, Irene is a PhD student in physics. And while she was gathering data for a study, there were several weeks when Irene and her advisor didn't see one another. So first, Irene was preparing samples in a different building from her advisor, and then her advisor went on a long trip. And when he returned, Irene became seriously ill. And on the heels of that, she had to give a presentation to her group. And the presentation showed feeble results. And the professor was upset with her. And the main takeaway from her advisor was that she didn't work enough or didn't work at all. And that was the impression. And this was I would say probably one of the main turning points for Irene, of not having her own hard work recognized in her own contributions, and not having an understanding of, the rest of her life as well. And this final example, example 4, Irene is still a PhD student in the lab, and she's advanced a little bit, and she's tasked with rerunning experiments to update a manuscript that received a revise and resubmit decision. Originally, the paper had been submitted by a lab member who had graduated and left, but by the time Irene and another student had rerun and written up the new experiments, this manuscript had been dramatically altered. But the advisor in charge refused to submit the paper as a new manuscript. And he only added Irene as the last author. So it was at this point that Irene came close to quitting her physics program. And it was also a turning point where Irene decided that she would not pursue academic research. So I'm going to turn now to recognition or lack of recognition in medicine, focusing on awards. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not my area, so I'm relying on existing research. And I also want to acknowledge that this information may be familiar to many of you. And I'm going to couch it in terms of Matthew and Matilda effects and consider cumulative outcomes. So the Matthew effect, which is sometimes called the halo effect, is coined by Robert Merton, and it describes a social phenomenon whereby individuals accrue success, social influence, and wealth in proportion to their initial level of performance or popularity. And so small initial advantages multiply over decades, they snowball. And that is another way of saying that is it's cumulative. They enjoy cumulative advantage. And there are some phrases that capture that, such as the rich get richer or success begets success. And the researchers argue that this Matthew effect is grounded in cognitive bias. If we see somebody who has some earlier success, we assume that it's deserved, and therefore we are more likely to bestow additional awards and attention and recognition upon that same person. Within STEM, men's work is more likely to be seen as notable. And the same is true for medicine. And the result is that men have more publications, more grant funding, more research awards and prizes. They are recognized in disproportionate ways of having higher, highly skewed as scientific creativity. And as a result of all of that, they also have disproportionate influence on the field. In contrast, the Matilda effect, which is put forth by Sue Rossiter, describes a phenomenon whereby women scientists are ignored, made invisible, and denied credit, often for their contributions. They relate this also to a cognitive bias, namely gender bias. Importantly, several studies point out that women participate in bias against other women. And why does this happen? Virginia Valian explains that this is because we are all cultural beings living in the same society, and we share the same gender schemas that overvalue men and undervalue women. And as a result of the Matilda effect, women in medicine and STEM often experience cumulative disadvantage over the course of their careers. So I think, as I mentioned earlier this week, I did a deep but non-thorough dive into the literature about awards given by STEM societies, societies of STEM subspecialties, residency programs, and medical schools. And here are some of the pieces I read. and most of them have been published in the last 5 or 6 years. And as I mentioned to Dr. Mazur earlier, one thing that really impresses me about medicine is that medicine has been tracking gender disparities for much longer, I think, than STEM, especially in terms of awards. And also, there's been a wonderful, ability to release all of these records from the member societies for this type of research. So those two things really impressed me. So I'm going to be talking about awards and why focus on awards. Out of all the aspects, according to the literature, awards are a way of publicly recognizing a person's achievements and valuing their contributions. And awards can also tangibly and positively impact a person's reputation. It can lead to promotion and other career advancements, such as leadership opportunities and external appointments. It could also lead to fruitful collaborations, higher financial compensation, visibility in the respective field and also neighboring fields, and have the ability to attract funding for themselves and for their institutions. And also, over the course of one's profession, awards can be a way to consolidate career accomplishments, such as what a Lifetime Achievement Award does. And here are some notable findings in the research. So the good news is almost every paper I read said that acknowledged that there are increases in numbers of awards given to women in medicine as a result of the increases of women in medical school and into careers in medicine. This parallels what's happening in STEM as well. However, the research shows that men still tend to claim the majority of the rewards. And one study said that this happens regardless of how many women and men are nominated. So it doesn't matter what the pool looks like, men will still receive more awards. When the types of awards are broken down, men are disproportionate awardees for scholarly research and for young investigator awards, while women are disproportionate awardees for service, teaching, advocacy, and for the advancement of women. One article I read noted also that women tend to receive awards early in their careers and less so later in their careers. And whereas men receive them consistently throughout their careers. Gender disparities are greater for prestigious awards as well, and multiple awards. So highly visible awards, Lifetime Achievement Awards, and multiple awards go disproportionately to men. And some research studies also pointed out the ways that the awards process helps to reproduce the Matthew and Matilda effects. For example, letters of nomination tend to contain gendered language, describing men, for example, as leaders and risk takers as opposed to women as compassionate. People who, the articles that noted letters of nomination also said that letters that support men tend to be longer and more detailed, and women's tend to be short and with vague descriptions. And then describing women-only awards. Ann Lincoln led a study in 2012 on awards and prizes given by 13 member STEM societies. So this is not just, this goes beyond medicine to other STEM societies. So Lincoln and her colleagues warn that women-only awards, while lifting up women, can also camouflage their underrepresentation of award recipients in unrestricted categories, such as for scholarly research. So it is a double-edged sword. That's my term, not theirs. In other words, including the count of recipients of women-only awards into the total count from a society can give the impression that gender disparities no longer exist for that society. So as a solution, Lincoln and colleagues argue that reports on awards should disaggregate restricted, such as women-only awards, and unrestricted categories. Some hopeful news from the research is that the chances for women receiving awards increase when women serve on nomination and selection committees. And when if there's one woman, it's okay. When there are two women, it's even better. And when a woman chairs one of these committees, it's one of the most positive outcomes or likelihood of a woman being selected. And the good or bad news, according to one article in Awards in Pathology, is that if nothing is done, given the trend of women's growing presence in medicine and the win rates of 11% over 60 years, gender equity will be achieved in this field in 120 years. Something I noticed because of the work that I do that's missing from I think all of the pieces in medicine that I was able to read is that there's no intersectionality perspectives, and such as like what are the awards given to women of color in medicine, and that's research I would love to see. Let's move on. So in conclusion, I just want to leave an incomplete list of recommendations. I hope we can build this during our Q&A time and going forward. First, I'm going to repeat the questions that Blair, Loy, and Seck pose. How is merit conceived of and defined? And how fairly and consistently is this definition applied? And what are the consequences for adhering to meritocracy? And what are those consequences for students, for professionals who are women and members of minoritized groups or who embody the intersectionality of both? And also, what are some ways that we can prepare for and practice recognition for women, women of color, and members of minoritized groups in teaching, research, and award processes? And again, I wanted to add about, attend to intersectionality, especially for invisibility and recognition for women of color. And I have one more slide of recommendations. So according to the research literature, here are some recommendations for improving award outcomes for women in medicine. Use gender neutral terminology in calls for these applications. Ensure gender diversity on nomination and selection committees. And again, have more than one woman and have women chairing committees. Develop and use a rubric, and the use of rubrics, research has shown, cuts down on bias. And encourage and nominate women. And women are often taught not to put themselves forward, not to self-promote. But self-nomination is a form of self-promotion, and the outcomes may be more awards. Invite and empower an oversight committee that ensures fairness at all stages. So this is an accountability measure. Make application processes be double-blinded and or gender-blinded. The research shows that when they are double-blinded and gender-blinded, that there are more women selected. Sustain awareness about personal biases. And you can easily take free online tests to, hone in on your own biases, and sometimes being aware of them is a strong step towards keeping them in check. And finally, release historical and contemporary records of awards as part of the accountability. Disaggregate by the type of award. Is it a research award? Is it a service award? Is it a women-only award? And also disaggregate by race and gender and perhaps other identities. That is the end of my talk. I want to acknowledge my team, my senior colleagues, and the funders for my work. And I have references here if anybody would like, and I've already shared this this PowerPoint with the organizers. And if anyone's interested in purchasing the book, Harvard Education Press is offering a discount to audience members. And I will stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ong, for this talk. We are going to do a few moments of Q&A. We have one in the chat right now, as well as a comment, but we'll start with Molly's question. Thank you so much. What are the starting years of the data of women in medicine that you were able to locate? I know you had mentioned that you were able to find that, you know, we have been looking in medicine at these trends for a long time. And as an archivist, Molly primarily experiences historical and raw data from 50 plus years still being in the physical format, so is eager to learn about your findings.
I'm sorry, could you read the question again?
Sure, it's also in the chat, but it says, what are the starting years of the data of women in medicine that you were able to locate? As an archivist, I primarily experience historical / raw data from 50 years plus still being in the physical format, so I'm eager to learn of your findings. And Molly, if you want to come off mute and say a little bit more, we welcome that.
I can answer that. Sorry, go ahead.
Just to say thank you.
Yeah, I'm only a reader of this work in medicine, but some of the earlier work that I was locating spoke to comparing, 1954 to 1964 and 2000 and 2010. If I have a moment, I can search my notes and find that that article for you. But yeah, I'm not surprised that a lot of this is written in physical formats, and I'm also doing an archival project right now, sponsored by the Spencer Foundation, and it is we're locating emails from and documents from people who were participating in an American Indian Society, Science and Engineering Society for 40 years ago, or 30 years ago, and everything is it's finally been digitized, but having to locate things, and we don't have the person power, and we don't have the equipment, and that to me in itself is very interesting. I think it's more frustrating for a lot of my team members, but that's just part of the work. It's part of the work of hunting those down and understanding their value and saying it's worth it, this, on the ground work.
Sandy, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mia. This was fascinating and really brought to mind so many ideas that I haven't really addressed at all. One of the things that you mentioned was photographs and how important they are. I remember visiting Joan Reed, who's one of Sinai's alums, who's a dean at Harvard, and she used some of the money she had left over from grants to line a hallway that's trafficked a lot between different buildings on the Harvard Medical School campus. And she had photographs made of the most diverse group of people who were not only faculty, physicians, scientists, but also staff, to really make it clear how much this was a community endeavor to be able to do the work. So I really think that's terribly important. I was very interested in your comment in terms of the awards for that the early awards seem to make a difference when you're looking at Matthew, that amplifies in terms of their Matthew being considered successful, and yet women were getting early awards, and fewer women who were in mid-career or later seemed to be getting the awards. And I'm just wondering, do you think that's part of the leaky pipeline that we observe, and not knowing which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do the women leave and therefore they're not available for the awards, or do they not get the awards and therefore they leave? Do you have any thoughts on that, Mia?
I think that's a good question. I don't think that's been fully answered yet. There is one paper that looked at the awards from one medical school. This was the Yale Medical School. And again, I have that reference in my on one of the slides. They looked at 13 years worth of awards to medical school students for various competitions. And they found, very similar to what I just presented, that men got most of the awards, men got most of the prestigious awards, and women did not. And they presented this to the current faculty and student body, and they also reported on the reactions of the current students. And the current students were very, very disheartened. They were very discouraged, and they said, why should I bother? Why should I put myself forward? Why should I work towards this? And it kind of makes some sense. I mean, I see this also in my own work in physics and other STEM fields. Like, why, if you know how the game is played and if you can sort of see the outcomes, why play the game? And, for the women who earn early awards, I mean, I think I would love to do a case study of somebody who earns an early award, just to follow that person through. I love longitudinal studies, just to see, is there cumulative advantage for particular folks, or do the systems, or is there a Matilda effect? And, there are some historical ones like Lise Meitner. If you just want to, you can just Google her and you can see, like, she had been nominated so many times for the Nobel Prize. She was instrumental towards getting the Nobel Prize, and she was denied. She was denied 46 times, I think, something like that. Ben Barr, who transitioned from being a man to a woman, had his scientific scholarship judged, and people were saying to him things like, you do much better science than your sister, not knowing it was the same person. So those kinds of, anecdotes, I think we'll call them, are very telling, I think, about how strong gender bias is, again, for men and women in judging women.
I can just tell you that the American Society for Cell Biology has a Women in Cell Biology Award that's for junior women. And it's been going for about 25 years. And I've noticed that several, and I should go back and quantitate, several of those women have gone on to win the most significant awards later on as well. So
That's great.
Look at that, and I'll share it with you.
That's an excellent counterpoint.
Yeah, thank you.
Kathy, I see you have your hand up. We are over time, but if you want to briefly share your comment or question, we welcome it. And then
I just wanted to really quickly ask, there's this idea of awards that support research programs, for example, but also just recognition. And would it help to create more opportunities of recognition, more awards, even if they're in name only? Is that something we could do in our societies and in our institutions, just to, the encouragement aspect? Because, you were talking about feedback from peers and recognition from peers. I mean, do you have data on that? If it's not like a big society award, but if, could we in our departments create awards, opportunities for recognition that can help encourage and bolster, especially early stage scientists, but people at all levels? Is that an idea worth pursuing? Is there any data to support that?
I don't know the data offhand, and I would have to think about it a little bit, but I think it's an idea. It has to be authentic. These awards, they have to be authentic. They can't be, you know, there can't be any whiff of, you know, I'm just doing this because you're a woman and we want to give you an award. Like this goes to the double-edged sword that I was talking about. It needs to be based on a rubric that has criteria that meets the values of your department or your institution and that reflects it. But, you know, I think that, I don't know if what you mean by saying there's nothing in it, but, you know, if there can be, you know, funding that goes, you know, we'll pay for you to take a trip to this conference, or you're gonna, well, you know, you'll be able to, I don't know, put something behind it that is beneficial. And the prestige of that award could grow over time, and I could see that happening. But I would just caution for authenticity
Mhm.
and you know, putting some funds behind it.
Great.
Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Ong, and thank you everyone for joining. It is 1:04, so we thank you for staying over and enjoy the rest of your days. Dr. Ong, we're having a small group meeting, but we're on a separate Zoom line, and some people have already started to jump on. So we can just jump onto that line, which should be in your calendar.
I
If
don't
it's-
know if I have it. If you could email that to me, I'll be on there. Thank you, everybody.
Okay,
you.
you know what? I'm gonna put it in the chat because I haven't communicated with you via email, so I don't actually have it. I thought somebody might have forwarded it to you. But I just put it in the chat. So we will go over there and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you. See you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.